He was an ex-Navy SEAL, haunted by a war that never left his mind. With the last of his money, he bought an old wooden cabin on the snowy outskirts of Minneapolis, hoping for silence, not salvation. But when he returned weeks later, smoke rose from the chimney, and someone was inside, an elderly couple, and a secret buried beneath an abandoned shed that would change everything. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from, and if this story touches your heart, please subscribe for more. Winter pressed against Minneapolis with the quiet weight of ancient ice. Snow clung to rooftops like frozen breath, and the world seemed to sigh beneath the pale sky as if bracing for something it could not name. Jake Miller stepped out of his truck and into that breathless cold, boots sinking into powder so soft it looked like crushed pearl. He paused, the wind tugging at the hood of his parka, and let the stillness settle around him. For a moment, just a moment, he hoped the silence might seep into the fractured corners of his mind. At 37, Jake carried the look of someone shaped by war more than by years. His frame was tall and spare, built for endurance rather than bulk, shoulders slightly rounded from the weight of too many rucksacks and too many regrets. A narrow scar cut through the stubble along his jaw, the kind of mark earned in a desert skirmish that never made it into any official report. His eyes were the striking part, storm gray, distant, always searching the edges of a room long before he stepped into it. People often mistook that alertness for intensity, but it was really an old habit of survival. The world had once tried to kill him more than once, and some part of him never forgot. Bear leapt down from the truck behind him, a powerful German shepherd of 4 years with thick sable fur and a deep chest made for winter and work. The dog was a contradiction, his amber eyes soft with devotion, yet his stance always alert, as if prepared to protect the man he followed like a shadow. Jake had rescued Bear from a failing K-9 training program years earlier, after the dog had shown too much stubborn independence for the military's liking. Jake claimed the two of them understood each other perfectly, both loyal, both restless, both slightly broken in ways they refused to talk about. They trudged toward the small cabin Jake had bought only weeks earlier, a squat structure of pine logs and peeling red paint sitting at the edge of a frozen clearing. He had chosen the place because it sat far from neighbors, far from traffic, far from the memories that lurked in crowded spaces. Minneapolis was too loud for the ghosts in his dreams. This cabin, he thought, might finally be where the noise inside him quieted. The door creaked open beneath his gloved hand. Immediately, Bear stiffened, the muscles beneath his fur hardening into tension. His ears pricked forward. A low rumble formed in his throat. Jake felt it too. Warmth. Someone had been inside, and not long ago. His instincts shifted, sharpening like a blade honed on stone. "Easy, buddy," he murmured under his breath, though the words sounded like he was trying to steady himself as much as the dog. The dim interior smelled faintly of old smoke and wool. The fireplace was dark, but the stones around it still held the ghost of heat. Slowly, as Jake's eyes adjusted, two shapes materialized near the hearth. An elderly man sat hunched beneath an unraveling wool blanket. He was thin, almost fragile, his shoulders narrow beneath a threadbare coat that had lost its battle with the Minneapolis winter long ago. His hair, once dark, had surrendered entirely to white, and his beard grew in a soft cloud around his sunken cheeks. Yet his eyes were sharp, a washed blue that flickered with both fear and pride. This was Henry Collins, though Jake did not know the name yet. Henry had the bearing of a man who had worked with his hands his whole life, steady, methodical, uncomplaining even as the chill gnawed at him. Beside him sat Martha Collins, his wife, her hands clasped in her lap as if in prayer. Martha was small and round-shouldered, her silver-gray hair pinned back loosely with a clip that had seen better decades. Her face, though lined with age, held an undeniable kindness, the sort that made strangers trust her and children adore her. Her coat was too thin, her boots worn smooth, but her posture had the stubborn dignity of someone who had learned long ago never to beg unless she had no other choice. When they saw Jake in the doorway, both flinched. Martha's hand flew instinctively to Henry's arm. Henry straightened, bracing himself not with aggression, but with the weary core of a man determined to protect the last thing he had left, his wife. Jake lifted his hand slightly, palms open. "I don't want trouble," he said, voice steady but wary. It was Martha who spoke first. Her voice trembled, but the gentleness in it never cracked. "We're so sorry, dear. We thought the place was empty. We only needed a little warmth, just for the night. The shelters were full." Henry nodded, though his pride made the gesture stiff. "We'll leave right away. Didn't mean to intrude on your property." Jake stared at them, and something inside him twisted. He had seen fear before, raw, animal fear in the faces of young soldiers on dusty roads, but the fear in these two was different. It wasn't terror of violence, it was terror of the cold, the kind that slipped into bones and stayed there, the kind that killed quietly. Bear approached them, sniffing the air. Instead of growling, the dog stepped forward and nudged Martha's knee with his nose. A soft whine escaped him, as if he too understood the fragility of what he saw. Jake exhaled slowly. His mind flicked to all the places he had tried to forget. Nights in Kandahar shelters where children slept on rubble, old men clutching blankets thinner than paper, widows who thanked him in trembling voices for things he hadn't done. He remembered how helpless he had felt then, a soldier fighting too many enemies and saving too few. These two elderly strangers, was something he could do something about. "You can stay," Jake said at last. The words felt heavy at first, but once spoken, they settled naturally into the air. "At least for tonight. It's too cold out." Henry's eyes widened, not with relief, but disbelief. Martha's lip quivered. She pressed a hand to her mouth as though stopping herself from crying. Jake cleared his throat, suddenly uncomfortable with the emotion thickening the room. "Just don't touch the tools in the shed, and watch your step near the hallway. Floorboards are loose." Martha nodded rapidly. "Of course, dear. Thank you. Truly." Henry extended a shaky hand. "Name's Henry. Henry Collins. This is my wife, Martha." Jake shook his hand, feeling the frailty in the older man's grip. "Jake Miller. And that's Bear. He's harmless if you're friendly. Mostly." Bear huffed, as if offended. Jake allowed the faintest smile. The cabin whispered with the sound of wind pressing against the windows, but for the first time since he'd bought the place, the inside did not feel empty. 3 lives, 1 scarred soldier, 2 exiled elders, and 1 loyal dog, found themselves gathered around a fireplace that hadn't yet been rekindled. In the heart of winter, the cold outside remained merciless. But inside the small wooden cabin, something faint and warm began to glow, not from fire, but from the fragile, unexpected beginning of a shared refuge. Night settled over the cabin like a heavy wool blanket pulled across the sky, though outside the wind tore at the eaves with a ferocity that made even the trees groan. Inside, lamplight flickered softly, casting long amber shadows along the wooden walls. Jake Miller sat at the small kitchen table with a mug of instant coffee, burnt, bitter, familiar, and listened to the quiet breaths of the elderly couple resting near the fire. Bear lay at his feet, tail curled around his legs, the dog's amber eyes tracking every movement with a calm loyalty that Jake had leaned on more times than he liked admitting. The cold had eased from Henry and Martha's cheeks, leaving behind the tired softness of those who had survived another winter day. Jake wasn't used to company. Silence had been his closest companion since leaving the Navy, and even now, with 2 strangers in his home, he felt the old instinct to withdraw. But war had taught him something he rarely voiced. A man alone is a man unguarded, vulnerable in ways he does not see. Somehow, despite the years, it felt easier to breathe tonight than it had the morning before. Henry stirred beneath the blanket, adjusting his thin frame. He was bundled in one of Jake's spare coats, too big in the shoulders, but warm. "Couldn't sleep much, son?" Henry's voice was gravelly, the kind shaped by years of cold winters and hard work. Jake shook his head. "Storm's loud. And Bear keeps thinking the wind's an intruder. Bear huffed as if insulted, then rested his chin on Jake's boot. Martha sat up slowly, brushing silver hair from her lined face. Thank you again, dear. We know we're a burden. Jake turned toward her, and something in him softened. Martha had the kind of presence that made a room feel gentler, like a warm quilt draped over a tired heart. You're not a burden, he said simply. It's cold out there. Nobody survives a Minneapolis night without shelter. Her eyes glimmered, though she blinked the emotion away. For people like the Collinses, gratitude was both a blessing and a weight. Silence drifted between them again, though this time it was lighter, almost comfortable. Then Henry cleared his throat. There's something we should tell you. Jake looked up. Bear's ears perked. Martha nodded, clutching the blanket closer round her shoulders. It's about our son, Daniel. The name carried weight, and Jake straightened in his chair as if recognizing the gravity beneath it. Henry's eyes grew distant, touched by grief that had not dulled with time. Daniel was a good man, stubborn like his mother, quiet like me. Always wanted to fix the world, even when the world didn't care much for fixing. Martha smiled faintly at that. He was tall, she added softly, lean like a man who forgot to eat when he was focused. Dark hair, gentle eyes. He always looked like he was thinking of something bigger than us. Or worrying, Henry muttered, rubbing his temples. Which is why he got tangled up with them. Jake leaned forward. Them? Henry nodded. Harbor West, the development group that's been buying up land along the Mississippi. They said they were building eco-friendly infrastructure. Daniel was hired as an environmental engineer to monitor their water systems. Martha's voice cracked. He found out they were lying, dumping toxic waste into the river, poisoning the fish, the animals, the people who lived near the banks. Jake's jaw tightened. He'd seen cover-ups before. Different terrain, different enemy, same smell. The smell of power rotting from the inside out. Henry continued. They pressured him to sign a falsified report, said nobody would question a bright young engineer vouching for them. His voice quivered. Daniel refused. Martha's hands trembled as she folded them tightly in her lap. He was dead 3 weeks later. Hit and run, they said. But our boy was careful. Always careful. Jake felt the familiar heat rise inside him, the slow burn of injustice, the kind that reminded him why he had once enlisted, why he had once believed he could stand between good people and the darkness waiting to swallow them. Before he died, Henry whispered, he came to us, told us that if something ever happened, if he didn't show up one day, we were to find the wooden shed that belonged to his best friend, Sam Whitaker. Bear shifted uneasily, sensing the tension. Jake frowned. Sam Whitaker? Henry nodded. He left Minneapolis years ago. Sick mother down in Iowa, sold his property, or so he thought. Turns out the land got absorbed into a bigger parcel, a real estate bundle. Martha met Jake's eyes with a trembling breath. That parcel is the land you bought, dear. Jake felt the room tilt, though only in his mind. The shed, the overgrown one at the far end of his property that he hadn't bothered to inspect yet. Sam's shed, Daniel's hiding place, the place he had said held something important. Jake rubbed a hand over the scar on his jaw. Fate had a strange sense of humor, cold, sharp, a little cruel. Martha's voice softened to a near whisper. We didn't come here to snoop, Jake. We just had nowhere left to go. But when the storm hit, Henry wondered if it was time, if we should look. Henry nodded, his blue eyes glistening with loss that years could not erase. Daniel trusted Sam. Sam trusted his shed. And now that land is yours, whether you wanted that responsibility or not. Jake stood, breath heavy. He moved to the window, looking out at the storm that smeared the night into white chaos. Bear came to his side, pressing a warm head against his thigh. Jake's inner world churned. He had come here to escape the weight of other people's battles, to find peace in isolation. But peace was fickle, and fate had always stalked him like an old enemy who knew his weaknesses too well. Behind him, the couple waited, Two aging hearts braced for disappointment, for dismissal, for another door shutting in their faces. Jake turned back toward them, and something resolute sparked in his storm-gray eyes. "In the morning," he said quietly, "we'll go to the shed." Henry breathed out shakily, not quite a sigh, not quite a sob. Martha wiped her cheek with the trembling fingers. Bear barked once, short and decisive, like a soldier acknowledging orders. And in the small wooden cabin at the edge of Minneapolis's frozen wilderness, the truth began to stir beneath the snow, waiting for sunrise. The wind rose long before sunrise, a low, feral howl that threaded through the pines like an old ghost calling for the living. Snow swept across the clearing in frantic swirls, turning the world into a restless white sea. Despite the storm's fury, Bear was the first to sense it, an urgency beneath the wind, a scent pulled from the frozen earth. The German shepherd jerked upright from his place beside the hearth, ears pricking forward. His muscular frame, wrapped in thick sable and cream fur, vibrated with sharp alertness. He was 4 years old, but carried himself with the confidence of a seasoned guardian, chest broad, paws heavy, eyes bright with instinctive purpose. Before Jake could rise from the small kitchen table, Bear bolted toward the door, claws skittering across the wooden floor. Jake was after him in seconds, tugging on his coat with practiced efficiency. "Whatever's out there," he muttered. "Better not be a moose looking for trouble." The joke fell flat. The tension in Bear's movements didn't match the curiosity of wildlife, but the precision of a trained canine catching a trail. Henry and Martha Collins appeared behind Jake, bundled in coats too thin for the storm. Henry leaned heavily on the cane Jake had found for him, a simple wooden stick with a rubber grip, its surface worn by years of use. His tall, bony frame shivered beneath Jake's oversized jacket, but determination flickered in his winter blue eyes. Martha clutched her scarf around her neck, breath quivering. Even in her frailty, her presence radiated the warm stubbornness of someone who had lived her entire life refusing to let circumstance define her. "Bear's found something," Jake said, pushing open the door just as the dog sprinted into the whirling snow. They followed him through knee-deep drifts, breath snatched away by the wind. The trees stood like frozen sentinels, their branches clawed with ice. They crossed the clearing toward the far end of Jake's property, a stretch of land he had barely explored, except for noting the shadow of a collapsed wooden structure on the day he bought the parcel. The shed. Sam Whitaker's shed. Bear reached it first, circling the structure with rapid, focused movements. His barking sliced through the storm, sharp, insistent. He halted near the back wall, paws digging wildly at the snow. Jake dropped to his knees, brushing aside the white powder with gloved hands. Henry sank down beside him, though his joints protested with a tremor. Together they cleared the top layer, revealing the warped outline of old planks. One plank seemed out of place, raised slightly as if lifted before. Jake wedged his fingers beneath the edge, pulling until the wood groaned open. Beneath it lay a hollow pocket carved into the ground, lined with oil-soaked cloth that had somehow kept moisture at bay. Inside, nestled like a relic from a forgotten past, was a metal box. It was small enough to cradle in both hands, but heavy as truth itself. Its steel surface was scarred and dented, latch rusted but still intact. Jake's breath fogged the air. He felt the weight of fate settling into his palms, the weight of someone's final act of courage. Henry's hand hovered over the box. The old man's fingers trembled not from cold, but from the fragile collision of hope and dread. "Daniel," he whispered. Jake carried the box inside the shed, shielding it from the assaulting wind. The structure was barely standing, roof sagging, walls riddled with gaps that whistled with snow-laden air, but it offered enough shelter to open the relic undisturbed. Bear stopped barking and sat guard at the entrance, chest heaving, eyes bright with an unspoken understanding that this moment mattered. Jake unclasped the latch with the tip of his pocket knife. The metal box opened with a stiff, reluctant creak. Inside, wrapped tightly in waxed cloth, lay a stack of papers, maps, receipts, photos, handwritten notes. The shed seemed to inhale. Henry did not. He stared, frozen, not like the landscape around them, but like a man suddenly touched by something sacred. Jake pulled the papers out one by one. The first was a blueprint stamped with Harbor West's insignia. Thick red lines snaked across the page, pipes burrowing beneath frozen soil, running parallel to the Mississippi like hidden veins. Waste diversion, the print read. Multiple segments circled in Daniel's precise handwriting. The next was a series of invoices, chemical names Jake recognized instantly from his deployments overseas, solvents used to dissolve metal, toxins classified as hazardous even in combat zones. And then the photograph. A flatbed truck parked under harsh floodlights, loaded with sealed barrels marked with Harbor West's logo. In the corner was a blurred silhouette of a man capturing the image. At the bottom right was a note scrawled in familiar handwriting. Henry let out a strangled sound and reached for the photograph. His fingers skimmed the corner as if afraid touching it would make the memory crumble. "That's Daniel's writing," he whispered. There were no tears yet, only stunned reverence. The world outside howled, but inside the shed, time slowed. Jake glanced toward Martha. She held the edges of her coat tightly, face blanched, eyes shining with grief sharpened by vindication. A mother did not need proof to trust her son's integrity, but proof allowed her to breathe again after months of suffocating doubt. Henry bowed his head, shoulders shaking. He knew, he murmured. My boy knew they would come for him. Jake placed a steady hand on his shoulder. He also knew you'd come here eventually. Martha's breath hitched. He wanted to protect us, even after he was gone. Jake nodded. And now he still is. Bear nudged Martha's leg gently, sensing her pain. She bent and stroked the dog's fur, fingers trembling through his thick coat. The shed felt warmer for a heartbeat. Warmer because truth had a heat of its own. Quiet, fierce, cleansing. Jake spread the papers across an overturned crate, analyzing the layout. There were coordinates written in shorthand, timestamps, chemical schedules. Daniel hadn't just stumbled onto wrongdoing. He had built a case, one thorough enough to topple a corporation. If only someone had lived long enough to deliver it. Jake imagined Daniel Collins not as a name spoken in grief, but as the man described the night before. A tall, lean engineer with thoughtful eyes and stubborn moral conviction. A man who had chosen truth over safety. A man whose death had been dismissed as a tragic accident. A man whose parents, frail and grieving, now stood witnessing the legacy he died to preserve. Jake felt something shift deep inside his chest, a familiar ache that he had tried to bury beneath routines and quiet solitude. A soldier's instinct to protect. To finish what another brave soul began. To stand where others had fallen. He looked at Henry and Martha, their aging faces framed by stormlight. "We're not letting this die with him," Jake said firmly. Henry lifted his gaze with the fragile strength of a heart breaking open. What do we do now?" Jake closed the metal box and tucked it under his arm. "We take this back to the cabin. Tomorrow we make copies, secure everything, and send it to someone who can't be bought." Bear barked once, sharp and certain, as if casting his own vote. And so, in that crumbling shed on a storm-lashed night, the truth Daniel Collins had died for rose from the ground like a thaw beneath the snow. Fragile, unstoppable, waiting for the world to hear it. The storm returned at dusk, darker and heavier than the night before, pressing against the windows as if the sky itself were trying to enter the cabin. Minneapolis winters always carried a certain brutality, but tonight the cold felt purposeful, almost sentient, like something holding its breath, waiting. Jake Miller sensed it long before anything happened. Instinct never fully left a man who had spent years stepping into hostile rooms and war-scarred valleys. He moved through the cabin with purposeful quiet, checking the locks, testing the latches, and positioning the metal box of evidence on the table beneath the small lamp. Bear followed him closely, tail stiff, paws silent on the floorboards. The German Shepherd paced with the hyper-focused intensity of a seasoned K9, chest rising and falling with sharpened breaths, ears twitching at each gust of wind. Henry and Martha Collins sat nearby, wrapped in blankets, their faces lit by the amber glow of the lamp. Martha's hands twisted nervously, her gentle features tense beneath the weight of fear. Henry, though trembling, managed a stern calmness, an old man's dignity forged from decades of labor, loss, and the weary knowledge that he had already lived through the worst life could take from him. Or so he thought. Jake checked the final copy of the scanned documents. The images of pipeline maps, chemical invoices, and the photograph Daniel had risked everything to take glowed on the screen of his old laptop. "Once I send this," he said quietly, "there's no going back." Henry nodded. "They took my son. They don't get to take the truth, too." Jake didn't respond, but something tightened inside him, a small, fierce agreement. Then Bear froze. His body stiffened like carved stone, muscles locked. A low growl formed deep in his chest. Not the warning of a curious sound, not the restless pacing of boredom. This was defense. This was threat. Before Jake could react, headlights cut through the storm outside, two harsh beams slicing across the snow and illuminating the window with sharp white glare. A black SUV rolled to a stop at the edge of Jake's property, engine idling with a deep mechanical rumble. Jake's pulse steadied, not quickened, not panicked, just steadied, sinking into the calm clarity that had kept him alive in the places far worse than this cabin. "Martha, Henry, get behind the kitchen counter," he whispered. Martha gasped but obeyed, helping Henry shuffle into the shadowed corner. Jake turned off the lamp, plunging the room into darkness except for the faint blue glow of the laptop. The wind howled. Snow struck the windows in frantic bursts. The world outside blurred to white. And then, a heavy thud against the porch. A second. Jake moved to the doorway, positioning himself at the wall, out of sight of the windows. Bear stood beside him, teeth bared, fur bristling along his spine like a warrior raising his shield. The first window shattered. Glass exploded. Inward, scattering across the wooden floor as the cold blasted in like a living thing. Martha screamed. Henry's cane clattered to the ground. Two men in thick parkas stormed through the broken frame. Both were large, broad-shouldered, heavy boots, faces obscured by black tactical scarves. One carried a crowbar gripped tight in gloved hands. The other held a small flashlight taped to a pistol, the beam slicing through the dark like a blade. New characters. Attacker number 1 moved with the brutish confidence of someone who believed intimidation alone could win a fight. Tall, thick neck, shoulders like a construction worker. His parka was torn at one sleeve, revealing a faded tattoo of a snake curling up his forearm. Ink blurred from years of rough work. His temperament was obvious, aggressive, impulsive, dangerous. Attacker number 2 was leaner, wiry, with twitchy movements and pale eyes that kept darting for threat. His sharp jaw was covered in several days of unkempt stubble, and a faint scar split his eyebrow, a mark suggesting he'd spent his life on the edge of trouble, maybe as hired muscle or failed security. He held the pistol like someone who'd used one before, but without discipline. They were not random intruders. They were men used to intimidation, used to force, used to shutting people up. They didn't expect a Navy SEAL. Bear launched first. His body surged forward with a terrifying, beautiful precision, like a spear of fur and muscle. The dog hit attacker number 1 square in the chest, teeth sinking into the man's padded arm, wrenching him backward with raw force. The man bellowed, stumbling. The crowbar clattered to the floor. Attacker number 2 swung the pistol toward the sound, but Jake was already moving. He dropped low, sweeping forward from the shadows with the fluid power of a man forged by conflict. He struck the attacker's wrist with a sharp, clean blow, sending the pistol skidding across the room. The attacker tried to swing a fist, but Jake stepped in, elbow driving into the man's ribs, then shoulder-checking him into the nearest wall. The man collapsed with a groan. Breath knocked from his lungs. Behind them, Bear dragged attacker number 1 away from the hearth, the man screaming for help as he flailed helplessly under the shepherd's weight. Jake grabbed the crowbar, pointed it toward both men. "Don't move," he growled. They didn't. Fear had overridden loyalty. Henry peeked from behind the counter, face pale but eyes fierce. Martha wept softly into her hands, her heart torn between terror and awe at the fury unleashed by the dog and the soldier protecting her. Jake bound the attackers with thick zip ties he kept for emergencies, a habit from years of dealing with the unpredictable. Bear continued growling softly, pacing in a small circle, never taking his eyes off them. When the cabin finally fell silent again, if silence could be called the distant roar of wind and the labored breathing of 2 defeated intruders, Jake returned to the table. His laptop screen blinked. The evidence waited. He selected every file, every scanned document, every picture Daniel Collins had risked his life to gather, and attached them to an email addressed to a single name: Marie Dalton, an investigative journalist known for her relentless pursuit of truth. Marie Dalton was a woman in her early 40s, petite but sharp, with black hair cut in a clean bob and wide, alert brown eyes set behind subtle square-frame glasses. She'd built her reputation by exposing corruption across state lines. Her writing was meticulous, her questions piercing. People said she had the soul of a prosecutor and the patience of a saint. She also despised corporate fraud, and she never backed down. Jake hit send. The tiny whoosh of the email leaving felt like an explosion. 3 days later, the world changed. Marie's article appeared on every major news outlet. Harbor West was thrust under federal investigation. Local officials were arrested. The CEO resigned. And Daniel Collins, after months of being dismissed as a tragic accident, was finally recognized as a murdered whistleblower. Jake read the headline aloud for Henry and Martha. Henry's shoulders shook with sobs he'd held for too long. Martha touched the photograph of her son with trembling reverence. Jake stood beside them silently. Bear leaned against Henry's legs, tail swaying gently. The truth had finally spoken, and the world had finally listened. The thaw came slowly, as if winter were reluctant to loosen its grip on Minneapolis. Snow retreated in thin, glistening sheets, drip by patient drip, revealing the dark soil and flattened grass beneath. The pines, once bowed beneath heavy drifts, began to straighten again, shaking loose the last remnants of cold like old grief falling away. And in the clearing at the center of that awakening landscape stood Jake Miller's cabin, no longer a refuge for one haunted soul, but a place where the lost and the weary found something like home. Jake emerged from the doorway carrying a pair of thick wooden beams balanced across his scarred shoulders. His breath rose in faint clouds, but the sting of cold no longer felt hostile. It felt like transition, like a world inching toward warmth. His face, usually set in its quietly guarded lines, seemed softer these days, still sharp along the jaw, still shadowed by memories he would never fully outrun, but lighter in the small moments. He'd aged backwards somehow, not in appearance but in spirit, as if a weight had shifted just enough for him to stand a little straighter. Bear trotted beside him wearing his new harness, navy blue with the words "Therapy Dog" stitched in bold white threads. The German shepherd carried himself with graceful confidence, tail swaying evenly, amber eyes bright. His coat gleamed with health now that he spent his days in service rather than tension, leaning against trembling knees, nudging lonely hands, standing guard not against intruders but against despair. Inside the cabin, the world had changed even more. Henry Collins stood in the kitchen, ladling soup from a large pot, steam rising around his weathered face. He had gained weight since the night Jake found him, still thin, still wiry, but steadier. His once shaky hands had regained their purpose, and though the lines of grief remained etched deeply around his eyes, they were joined now by lines of quiet contentment. Martha bustled about the main room, which had become a small haven of mismatched armchairs, thick quilts, shelves lined with donated books, and a new wood-burning stove Jake installed himself. Martha's gray hair was now pinned back with a bright blue clip, a gift from a visiting veteran's granddaughter, and she wore it with proud simplicity. Her cheeks were flushed with the warmth of cooking and movement, and her gentle voice floated through the air like soft stitching sewing the space together. This wasn't merely Jake's cabin anymore. It had become Winter Haven Center, a quiet, unassuming sanctuary where elderly folks whose pensions couldn't stretch through the cold months, veterans whose minds still carried battlefield shadows, and anyone who needed a place to breathe found shelter. Jake had never meant to create a community, but sometimes purpose grows in the ashes of survival. The first visitor that morning shuffled up the path with slow, uneven steps. His name was Thomas Reed, a retired firefighter in his late 60s with a frame still broad from decades of hauling hoses, though his left shoulder slumped slightly from an old injury. His thick gray hair curled from beneath a worn beanie, and his beard, full, salt and pepper, and wild enough to suggest he had once been handsome in a rugged mountain man way, framed his weathered, sun-patched skin. Thomas had a voice like gravel warmed by ember heat, rough but kind. He'd lost his wife 2 winters ago, and the grief had hollowed him quietly until Henry met him by chance at the local clinic and invited him to visit. "Morning, Jake," Thomas called, though his tone carried the heaviness of someone still learning to lift his own voice. "Anything you need a hand with?" Jake nodded toward the beams. "If you're offering, grab the other end. We're reinforcing the porch rail today." Thomas chuckled softly. "Good. Give these old bones something useful to creak about." As they worked, Martha welcomed 2 more guests, a petite woman named Linda Shaw, former high school music teacher with silver blonde hair tied into a neat braid down her back, and Mr. Vernon Price, a stoic Vietnam veteran whose brown eyes carried the tired wisdom of someone who had lived through things no one ever asked him to explain. Bear moved among them all like a silent conductor directing the rhythm of the place. He nudged Thomas's leg gently, leaning his weight just enough to ground the man. He placed his head in Linda's lap, coaxing a soft laugh from her. When Mr. Price arrived, stiff and quiet, Bear simply sat beside him, offering presence instead of pressure. Jake watched from the porch as the warmth inside grew like a living thing, fed by gentle voices, clinking mugs, and the collective exhale of people who had endured too much alone. Henry noticed him lingering and stepped out with 2 cups of fresh coffee. "You did something good here, Jake," Henry said, handing him one. "Never thought I'd see this place full of life." Jake sipped the steaming drink, letting the heat settle in his chest. "I didn't do it alone." Henry smiled softly. "No, but sometimes one spark is all it takes." Jake thought of Daniel, of the box beneath the shed, of the truth that had finally found daylight. He thought of how grief could hollow and heal at the same time, depending on who held it. He thought of Martha's fragile strength, Henry's stubborn resilience, and Bear's unwavering loyalty. Purpose, connection, healing. Words he never trusted were now carving themselves into the days without asking permission. Later that afternoon, a light snowfall began again. Not harsh, not threatening, just soft. The kind that felt like a benediction rather than a warning. Inside, Martha hummed as she poured tea for their guests. Thomas shared a story from his firefighting days, drawing a rare laugh from Mr. Price. Linda began teaching a few elderly women how to make simple paper stars to hang by the windows. And Bear wandered from person to person, offering quiet comfort with each gentle nudge. Jake stood at the center of it all, the edges of his old wounds softening beneath the glow of lives mending around him. The world outside was still cold, still uncertain, still capable of cruelty. But here, on this once-forgotten piece of land, warmth held its ground. Winter had learned to heal, and so had they. In the end, the story of Jake, Bear, and the lives healed at Winter Haven Center reminds us that miracles rarely arrive with thunder or blazing signs. More often, God works quietly through ordinary hands, through a shared meal, a warm room on a cold night, a loyal dog leaning against a weary soul, or a stranger choosing kindness when the world expects indifference. In our everyday lives, these small mercies are the threads that hold us together, proof that faith is not found only in churches or grand moments, but in the gentle ways we lift one another up. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to share it with someone who might need a reminder that light still exists in dark seasons. Leave a comment, tell us your thoughts, and don't forget to subscribe so you'll never miss another story of hope, courage, and God's quiet miracles. May the Lord bless you, guide you, and protect you and all those you love in every chapter of your life.